Hi, hello again. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back with our continuation of our Sunday school lesson from Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio. As you remember, we worked our way through the New Testament in these lessons, and now that we've had to go to remote learning, and we're now in the middle of the Old Testament. This is from 1 Samuel, part 4 of 1 Samuel, and the title would be David the Outlaw. Now, this is an interesting way to look at it because most people are not aware of this. Unless you study the Bible in great detail like we're doing, you're not aware that David didn't just play on his harp and slay Goliath and become king. He had this long, complicated, bloody progression where he had to stay alive and then eventually succeed King Saul. And next week we'll see how he has to take over and consolidate his kingdom. So it's a very complicated story. It's very brutal. This is a very brutal time. It's a very bloody time. But this is the way it is. Now, the other point is you're getting into a different era in the history of the Old Testament. When we talked about the Exodus story and the judges and stuff, there were often three different stories on how they found David, three different stories on how they picked Saul. Because they had these various sources that were brought together during the Babylonian exile after 500 BC or so. When you get into the David era, you get to an era where Hebrew has become a written language. What they have found is small inscriptions on a piece of pottery, a broken piece of pottery, or on a little bit of a seal you would put on a jar belonging to so-and-so, servant of the name of king. This is they call it Proto-Hebrew, which is the predecessor of Hebrew now. We have modern Hebrew now. You've got an intermediate way it's written. And this is the very early, because it's 3,000 years ago. We didn't have much written English to go back into any at that time. But English has changed in how it's writing. In the old days, 500-600 years ago, they used to capitalize all the nouns, which we don't anymore. So this is probably a written era. Therefore, David, when he gets established into his kingdom and he becomes a regional power, he's going to have court historians. Everybody who has the ego to maintain this kind of power wants to have a record. And they actually make references later in Samuel and to the records of the court historian. There's some stories that are very clear that had to be first-person accounts. Later in this, after the Absalom rebellion, there's a story where David's general, Joab, takes Absalom's general as a captive around the corner of the building and knifes him and kills him and comes back. Now, how would this story get into the record? There's only one way. Joab had to tell him. He's the only one who survived that encounter between the two of them, so he had to be the source. So you're really getting into an era now where you're getting a lot of what the historians call first-person narrative, where it's not someone writing about these people 100 years ago. Like if we wrote a book about D-Day in France 70 years ago, you'd have to use the historical record. This is a person who wrote down the historical record. Now, it's been lost. We don't know what happened to it. We don't know what kind of material it was on, etc. But it gives us a much more comprehensive, much more personal history with various personal comments in here about the characters and the drama and the action. So you're into a different era with the history. David's story, as we've said before, and we'll continue on, is extremely complicated. And you'll find a whole series of phases that he goes through. He emerges as the shepherd boy. He's a clearly powerful personality. He's a warrior. He's a musician. He's a charismatic leader. People will follow him to the death. I call him probably, we don't really know, but probably mesmerizing. We could just make people adore him. And like Jonathan, Saul's son, and Michal, his first wife, Saul's daughter, they just basically fall in love with him. So he's a mesmerizing personality. But this is a very difficult time because at this time we're going to cover right now, Saul is still alive. And Saul is really struggling mentally. And exactly what happened to him mentally is not clear. On a theological basis, he had received the divine charisma, God's blessing to be the great king, and he wasn't doing it. And he violated a major thing about slaughtering all these people and all their animals, and God rejected him and said, hey, I found someone better. this neighbor of yours, this David boy, is going to succeed you as king. And Saul goes ape over this, as anybody would. And he tries to repent, and God says, nope. And then he tries the traditional king thing. What do you do when you're an oppressive king and there's a rival threatening your throne? You try to kill him. I'm not advocating it, but that's what the reality is. So you'll have a series of stories in this account where David's trying to keep Saul from killing him, and Saul is trying to get a hold of David and kill him. And it's complicated and it's bloody. And so David figures out that he's in trouble with Saul, and so he flees, which is what you do in these situations. First he goes across the river into the kingdom of Moab. Moab is a rival kingdom. They're not pals. They're traditional enemies. This would be like people in Hitler's Germany fleeing into France for safety, or vice versa. And so he takes his family over there and asks the king of Moab to protect him. And the king's probably thinking, okay, I'll protect him because it's in my advantage to make more trouble for King Saul, who's my rival. This guy may be a rival later, but he's not now. And had an interesting little point in there too, that a lot of the disadvantaged, the dispossessed, the abused people, particularly from the tribe of Judah, David's own tribe, which is 40% of the whole population of the Hebrews, if they're feeling abused and dispossessed, they join him, at least the men do. And so he has this band of loyal followers, about 600 people, and he operates as a guerrilla band. That's the term. They didn't use that term in the old days. That came out of the Napoleonic era. But they operate as a guerrilla band, hit and run here, hit and run there, go and hide up in the mountains. And he works out of the spine of the mountains down in the southern part of the kingdom, south of Jerusalem, down in the area. Jerusalem is not a Hebrew. It's still owned by the Jebusites, the original owners. David conquers Jerusalem. And he operates in the hills there because they have the support of the people. Because the key of being a successful guerrilla fighter is having the support of the people. And so you're heading into a situation now where David is on the run, and he's in great fear, and he goes to a lot of lengths to stay away from Saul. So Saul is in his rage and being rejected, goes to Nob, the priest of Nob. If you remember last week, we talked about the priest of Nob. David and his band came by. They were hungry and they were running from Saul, and the priest gave them the sacred bread. And they gave him Goliath's sword. And there's a guy who is an Edomite, who's a professional soldier, a mercenary working for Saul, sees this. And so they moved on, and Saul comes up on these people. And this professional soldier, the Edomite, I think Doeg is his name, tells them that this is what they did. They betrayed you to David. They gave him the sacred bread. They gave him Goliath's sword. And Saul says to his soldiers, they call it his professional soldiers in the text, he's slowly accumulating what he didn't have before, which is an army that works for him, not for the tribes, professional soldiers. And in the end, that's the core of any good army, your regulars, and not your volunteers. And he tells them to kill all the priests off. And they just stand there. They're not going to kill off God's priests. They didn't do anything wrong. And so finally he says to Doeg, the Edomite, well, kill him. So it says he kills all 85 of them. That's a lot of people to kill by yourself when you just got a sword. So he probably got some of the other people to do it with him. There were probably some other mercenary, because the mercenary soldier owes loyalty to the boss, not to the tribal group or anything like that. It's the person that's going to pay him and keep him safe and reward him. So that's, it's a pretty discouraging story. And David hears about this. One of the guys gets away and tells David. David said, join my band. This is how he accumulates people running on the run from Saul. And they join him. And then David hears, that the Philistines are going to attack the city of Keilah, which is west from there toward the Philistine area. Where they are now is southeast from Jerusalem, down below Hebron, up in the mountains. And they're going to attack the city to the west. And David says to God, should I attack it? And David's men said, don't. It's too big a risk. The Philistines are too strong. Don't do it. And David goes through several prayer rituals or whatever to ask God, should I do this? And God said, yes, I will protect you. I will give you victory. So he goes down to the city. The details aren't clear. If the Philistines were outside the city attacking it, David could pin them against the walls, and he wipes them out and drives them back into Philistia, and he becomes the ruler of that area. So he goes into the city, which in its own way is actually a trap, because if you're in that city, Saul can come up and trap you. So David's fretting, and he says to God, are these people in this city going to defend me, or are they going to betray me? And God says, they're going to betray you. Hit the road, David. So David takes his men and splits and gets away. Again, this is how you have to be very careful as a guerrilla leader that you don't let people betray you. And he goes back and he hides in the desert to the south, a place called Kip, and it's down southeast from Hebron, not quite to the Dead Sea, but up in those mountains. If you've ever been down there, this is really rugged territory. It's basically desert. I'm certain there's some watering holes, but you got to know where they are. So he goes down there, and he's hiding out down there. And then some of his soldiers decide they will betray him to King Saul. And David gets wind of this, and he's able to escape. Now, this is a very important point, because the real way in this era, where they didn't have airplanes, they didn't have motorized vehicles, they had to walk, they only had swords and arrows. The way you catch somebody like this is you have somebody betray him, because if he has the support of the people will say, I don't know where he is. Even if they do know, it'll get away. But if you have people that'll betray him, that's how you catch him. The great story that was in the Braveheart movie of William Wallace, the great Scottish patriot about 1200 AD, they couldn't beat him, but some of the other Scottish nobility was jealous, and they betrayed him. And the English caught him, tortured him to death. So the way you with these people is you betray them. Benedict Arnold betrayed us. He almost gave Washington away to the British, which would have pretty much ended the revolution. So traitors are very difficult. They're very scary. So in this kind of guerrilla war, you have to be very aware of people betraying you. You have to keep a close eye on them. Be very, very careful, because that's how they catch you. British never caught Francis Marion, the swamp fox, a legendary hero down in the Carolinas. Nobody betrayed him. They could never find him. He had the support of the people. And so David escapes. Saul pursues him. You have an interesting story here. And you have two of these stories together where David has a chance to kill Saul and won't do it, because Saul is God's anointed king, and I can't kill him. First, when he's in a cave, and he's hiding in the back of the cave. And there's a lot of caves at these are limestone hills, so you get a lot of caves, because the limestone erodes very easily in the water. So he's hiding in the back of the cave, and Saul comes in the cave to, quote, cover his feet, unquote. Now, this is a polite biblical term for using the latrine, going to the bathroom, whatever you want to say. So Saul's in the... My production crew is making faces at this story. Sorry, Brianna. But this is what it means. We have a scholarly class here. And so he's in there covering his feet, and David's behind him in the cave, and they're telling David, "Hey, you can go kill him." David says, "I can't kill this guy." So David sneaks up and cuts part of the hem of his cloak off. He'd probably taken his cloak off to do his business. Cuts that off kind of as a souvenir, hides back in the cave, and Saul leaves. When Saul gets down out of the cave across the way, David comes out of the cave and shouts at him, "Hey, look at this. I've got your cloak." Kind of yeah, but I'm not going to kill you. You're God's anointed. Basically, he's trying to say, why are you mad at me? I'm not trying to kill you. You're trying to kill me. I don't want to kill you. Why are you mad at me? Why are you angry with me and all this? And they shout back and forth, and Saul recognizes his voice and recognizes him. And he kind of says, well, I'm really not trying to do this, et cetera, et cetera. They go on and to another episode. So in the middle of this, Samuel the prophet finally dies, and he dies in peace. And that's a segment in there, and it'll be important later. So Saul continues to chase David. He can't catch him. David's on one side of the hill and he's on the other, and he camps out. David has another opportunity to kill him. They're asleep in the camp. He didn't have very good guards. They're asleep in the camp, and David and one other guy creep into the camp, creep into his tent, And the guy wants to take Saul's spear and pin him to the ground, which would do him in, okay? And David says no, and they take the spear and they take this water pitcher, urn, whatever it is, and sneak out. And then the next day, they're out up on the hills. They see Saul and say, hey, I've got your spear, and I've got your water pitcher, and I could have killed you, and I'm not going to. Okay? He just isn't going to do it. And so he goes off and continues to hide down toward the desert, the Negev, southeast from Hebron. Hebron was the most southern village in that area at that time. Beersheba didn't exist then like it does now. And so the Philistines are lining up to attack Saul, and they're up near Megiddo. And so this is a climactic and tragic scene. So Saul takes his people up there. Excuse me, I'm getting ahead here. After this episode with the taking the spear and all that, David thinks, I can't do this anymore. I got to flee to the other side. I've got to become a traitor, an outlaw. And he goes over and joins the Philistines at one of the Philistine cities of Gath. Remember, the Philistines had 5 major cities. I can't remember all the name of them. And they were basically city-states. They would get together, but they ruled themselves independently. And so he goes down to one of them, the southern one, Gath, and joins their army. And they're suspicious. We know who this guy is. And then they're very happy to have him. They assign him the task of attacking the tribes to the south. There's a lot of non-Hebrew tribes down in the Negev desert. If you remember, if you go all the way back to the Exodus story and the other things, these people are constantly fighting with the Hebrews, fighting with everybody. That's what they do. They're bandit tribes. They're bandit tribes in Sinai even now. So David attacks them, and he's really rough and brutal. Nobody survives David. He kills them all, the men, the women, the kids, everybody. And so the Philistines think, hey, this guy's a real find. You know, he's really been very important to us. But David's careful. He's not fighting the Hebrews. He's fighting for the Philistines, but he's fighting their other enemies. This guy's very smart, and this is all very tricky. And so the Philistines decide, okay, it's time to make a major move against Saul, and they're going to attack up into the northern part where near where Megiddo is now. Megiddo is a fortress on one side of this north side of this large valley called the Jezreel. And the Jezreel Valley has historically, and even now, is the major artery from leaving the coast and going up through the mountains. It's a valley through the mountains. Beautiful valley. I've been there. Up into the area around Syria. You can avoid the major bluffs and all that and going in this way. This is kind of the classic trade and invasion highway of this area, invading down from Syria down to the plain, invading from the plain up into Syria, the valley of the Jezreel. And that's where Megiddo is on the north side. But Saul and his army is on the south side. So Saul's really nervous. I mean, he thinks, what's going to happen to me? So he talks to his people and he said, is there a necromancer around? Now, Saul had banned the necromancers. Necromancers were witches or witch doctors or fortune tellers or whatever you want to say, spiritualists who could contact the other world, the underworld, the netherworld, whatever you want to call it. And Saul had banned them and tried to kill them off because it violated the Yahweh faith. But he said, is there any of them around here? And they said, yes, there's a witch over at Eindor. So he disguises himself because this necromancer would know, if this is Saul, he's going to kill me because we're forbidden to do this. So he disguises himself and says he wants you to call someone up from the underworld. That from what little we understand about the Hebrew world at that time, what they thought happened to you when you die, they didn't have a heaven, they didn't have a hell. You kind of got parked in the underworld like the Greek underworld, pagan Greeks thought. So he calls up Samuel. And you read the account, it's not clear whether Samuel actually appears just to the necromancer, which is what I think, or it appears that Saul sees him also. It seems to me that the necromancer describes to Saul what she sees, which is this old man wrapped up in a robe, and he's saying, why are you bothering me? Why are you summoning me? What are you doing this for? and he's angry and crabby. I guess he's been in a long nap, and they wake him up, and so he basically, and Saul says, "What's going to happen to me?" And so he says to Saul, "You're going to get beaten in battle, and you and your sons will all get killed, and David will become the king. I told you this. This is God's mad at you. This is what God decided to do. Why did you wake me up to get this?" And Saul is distraught, as anybody would be, and kind of collapses on the ground. Then the necromancer sees it's Saul, and she thinks, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to get killed in here." And so his people basically take him away. He had a couple people with him, and he gets ready to do battle, even though he's been told, "You're going to lose." So the battle's about to start, and these other Philistine cities, the other 4 of the cities, said, "We don't want this David guy in with us." And I said, "Well, he'd be behind at the back." We don't want him there, because if he's betrayed one side, he could certainly betray the other. The British never trusted Benedict Arnold, because they thought, well, he betrayed his own compatriots, he'd betray us right back. It's just that Americans didn't want him back except to hang him. So they said, "You got to send him away." So they send David away. David leaves and goes back into the southern part of Judah and hides there. And this is up in the northern part of what became the old northern kingdom. And there's a huge battle on Mount Gilboa. And they attack, and they drive the Hebrews back, and they beat them. And along the way, Jonathan and Saul's other sons get killed. And there's 2 stories about how Saul dies. And you're not really clear which one, they're a little bit different, which one's the truth and which isn't, and you really don't know who to believe here. So it doesn't really make any difference. So the first story, which is the end of 1 Samuel, is that Saul is wounded, probably by an arrow, and he's leaning on his spear. And he says to his armor bearer, "Kill me, run me through. I do not want these uncircumcised people to catch me and make fun of me," and all that, because they would be really mean to him if they caught him alive. The armor bearer won't do it. He's not going to kill the king. So Saul and his armor bearer each fall on their own swords, which is kind of like the old-time version, similar to harakiri that the Japanese would do, which in the Japanese just be belly cutting. So they fall on their swords to kill themselves. And this is one of the very few suicides reported in the Old Testament. Keep this in perspective, this was, in those days, an honorable way to recognize you lost a battle. And you didn't want to be captured. They didn't have any polite rules about what to do with captives. They had their fun with them. And so this was an honorable way out of this situation. And is that what happened? I don't know. And remember that we did not have prohibitions on suicide until 400 AD, St. Augustine. There's nothing in the New Testament that forbids suicide. And there's nothing in the Old Testament that forbids it. It's not common in the Old Testament like it was in the Roman army and other things like that. At that era, it was regarded as a noble, dignified way of getting yourself out of an impossible situation. So the prohibition in Christianity against suicide is from St. Augustine in 400 AD. He said that only God can decide when you live and when you die, and suicide is self-murder. So in Catholic theology, a person that commits suicide is eternally damned, because you're taking into your hands God's decision about life, etc. So that comes from St. Augustine, and that's expanded into the consideration of the sanctity of life, which I agree with, but it's not in the New Testament. It's in Augustine 400. So anyway, this is one of the few suicides in the Old Testament. And then the second story is from 2 Samuel chapter 1, which is part of our readings. And there's an Amalekite who was a different tribesman who had joined. These people would float back and forth if they wanted to join an army. And he was serving in Saul's army, and he survives this. And he gets back and finds David's camp, which is probably down in the southeast. And he tells them Saul is dead and Jonathan's dead. And David asks him what happens. And he said, well, I came up and Saul was wounded, and he didn't want to be captured. And so he wanted me to kill him, so I did. Instead of saying, thanks for bringing me the message, David tells one of his people, kill this guy. because this guy killed God's anointed. Okay, and none of us have the right to kill God's anointed. So the guy does kill him. David tears his clothes and fasts and puts on dirt and stuff like that, all the things they do. It's a very interesting story. Which one of these is true? I don't know. And you really can't figure it out, because the first story could be true only if someone survived and watched it and then snuck away and got away. Because it was, if Saul and his armor bearer were the only two there and they killed themselves, nobody's going to be able to recount it. You don't really know. Could the other guy have been telling the truth? Maybe. Could he have been lying? Sure. So you don't really know. It's fascinating. It doesn't really make much difference, but in a historical base, I'm always intrigued by which of these stories is the most logical, but this is not logical. Human behavior is not logical. So anyway, they find Saul's body, the Philistines do. They cut his head off as a trophy. Like I said, this is a gross time. And then they take his body and tack it up on the wall of one of their fortresses at Beth Shean. Leave it up there. Now, why you want this body up on your wall after a day or two, you're going to really notice it. So later that night or the next day, some of Saul's followers come and take it down and burn it, which was the tradition apparently at that time, and bury the bones. And so that's the story. So at this point in the account, the only one who's been anointed king now is David. Now, he doesn't have the crown. He's just another person combating for it. But the king is gone, and the Philistines are dominant at this point. They're not directly ruling everything, but they're dominant, and the Hebrews are going to have to thrash out who becomes king. So the next session is the struggle to decide this. See, this is, like I said, the David story is far more complicated than David playing his harp and killing Goliath and becoming king and having Bathsheba and this and that. There's a lot more stuff in between, and it's a great detail, which I think is because they had a court historian. After David got to be king, all this account was put down accurately, and it kind of flows right along. So the next reading is 2 Samuel, or into 2 Samuel, chapters 2 through 9 comprehensively. And this is the struggle of David as he consolidates the kingship. He gets recognized as king of the southern kingdom, Judah. And the question is, how does he able to consolidate over all the Hebrew tribes? And that's where we're going next time. So this is Dr. Guthrie. It's been a pleasure. And if you noticed that there's no fire behind me anymore, well, that's because the gas people were here and they said, hey, you got a leak in your fireplace. So they turned it off. And we've ordered a new set, and it'll be here in 3 or 4 months, hopefully by the time the winter comes. So if you miss the fire, I miss it. And we all miss it here, but no more fire in the background until we get a replacement, which will come in God's good time. So we'll find out. The guy said, we got these on order. I said, how about September? And he says, well, maybe, so okay. So anyway, that's why we're not having any fire. It's been a pleasure.